You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. The Conservative Member of Parliament for the British government, Louise Mensch, has recently announced she will stand down after 2 years in Parliament. In her resignation letter, Mrs Mensch thanked the Prime Minister David Cameron for his support, but said she'd been struggling for some time to find the best outcome for her family life and had decided, in order to keep the family together, to move to New York, where her husband lives. The 41-year-old thanked Mr Cameron for allowing her to work from her constituency on Thursdays and Fridays so she could spend more time with her children. But she added, unfortunately, it had not proved to be enough. She was sorry that despite her best efforts, she was unable to make the balancing act work for her family. With me in the studio today is Mike Buchanan, the Chief Executive of the Anti-Feminism League, Lynn Burnham, Secretary of Mothers at Home Matter, and taking part in the discussion on the telephone is Avril Lehman, a leadership psychologist and founder of Whitewater Group. Avril is married with 2 daughters and is writing a book on motherhood and coaching. What should a woman in 2012 put first? A career or her family? Mike Buchanan.
I think different women sort of have different inclinations here. I mean, there was some very interesting research published in 2000 by a lady called Dr. Catherine Hakim, who was then a senior research fellow at the London School of Economics. And her research indicated that about 17% of women were very much home-centred, very, very family-focused, children-focused. About 69% of women were what she called adaptive, so they would flex their working responsibilities and family responsibilities over time. And only 14% of women, 1 in 7, was truly work-centred. Really was ambitious and work focused in the way that men more typically are, and most childless women were focused in this group. So the women who are very, very work focused are very untypical. I mean, the thing that we object to is women being shamed and vilified when they want to be stay at home mothers, for example. And some websites, I mean, Mumsnet comes to mind. I've read some things that have been said, have been written to stay-at-home mothers, and not necessarily mothers, but women who stay at home and are supported by a partner. And some of the rhetoric is vicious and cruel, quite frankly, and I think it's appalling.
Lynn Burnham, the Secretary of Mothers at Home Matter, you're agreeing with Mike there, nodding your head.
Mothers at Home Matter have been in existence for over 20 years. We were formerly known as Full-Time Mothers. But to get away from the issues of if you're not a full-time mother at home, are you not a good mother? We decided 18 months ago that we needed to change our names to Mothers at Home Matter. But we really do fight for the rights of children to have that bond with one of their parents, and in society throughout the ages, that person has been the mother. We're not against fathers being at home. Sometimes that is what is necessary in that particular family. Some fathers, their careers were never as important to them as the mothers were. But we strongly believe that at the end of the day, it's generally the mothers that provide that bond with the child. And the child needs that bond, especially in the early years.
How has your fight increased over the last few years then? Are you fighting harder to convince women to stay at home? What are your biggest battles?
Our biggest battles with government, with Parliament. That's where our battle lies. It's not with the mothers. Mothers in general would rather be at home in the first few years. Most mothers. I mean, there are women that can't wait to get back to work the minute that they've had a baby, and then that's fine. We're not against women going back to work. It's about the choice, and I'm afraid in today's society there's very little choice. It's encouraged that every opportunity to get back to work. But it just doesn't work out that way. We saw from the riots last year just how, broken our society is at times. And we strongly believe that if children are to have the best chance in life, they need to bond with the mother. The mother needs to be able to have that time with their child in the early years. As time progresses, the children become more and more independent. And, we're not against women working. We're not anti-feminism. or anti-feminist, but we are there to support women, because some people find it very hard being at home, and we don't deny that. But it's about making sure that there's the support and recognition that government at the moment doesn't provide.
Avril Lehman.
I'm intrigued. We would never dream of asking men, what would you put first, your career or your family? Because we have a history of men going out to work and basically coming back and seeing their children when they've been washed and are ready for bed. And we have real issues about the importance of the role and the minimisation of the role of men, in fact. I think what's interesting and different about women is that we are much more heterogeneous. We all want to do it differently. And I'm absolutely with Mike and with Lynn about the fact that a woman's right to choose, whatever that is, we should be supporting. And in fact, I think leading the way for many men who would also like to make different choices. Men classically and traditionally, and at this point, are much more homogeneous. You drop them into a suit, they're wanting to go up the organisation. Women want to all do it differently, and to do it differently at different stages in their lives. And I'm fascinated. There's always such a big emphasis on the early stages. And we know all the research, the psychological research about bonding and means early attachment, but it doesn't mean 24/7. And the times for me when it was so much more important to be around was when you were doing the transition to secondary school, or they were reaching puberty and the boys or drugs or any of those things came in. So we know that family influence is really, really important. And we are, after all, raising the citizens of tomorrow, so there can't be anything more important. And so this binary work or not work, to my mind, is a nonsense. How do we have a modern society, modern organisations that use the best of talent and make it feasible, where partners nowadays in Gen Y, they're all going to want to have careers, pursue things, and raise their children. So we need a kind of modern thinking here rather than any element of blame. We have an issue, and I think it was the Danish Prime Minister who said there isn't a country anywhere like Britain where you have highly educated women with excellent qualifications who are at home. How can your economy ever recover? And, it's apocryphal really, but I watch my friends who have been over-engaged with the school. They're down there complaining, questioning, and living vicariously at times through their children, whom they're pushing their daughters to get A stars and everything. And then when you say, so what do you want them to do with their future? You realise that they are thinking they're going to marry a rich banker rather than they're preparing them for a kind of structured, independent life of choice. And I think this is such backward thinking. And in fact, it's not backward thinking, because for most generations, most centuries, the whole family worked from an early stage. We all worked, and we saw as much of your dad as you would see of your mum when you go out to the fields or whatever. So it's very modern and very, well, in fact, post-50s, where suddenly we had to put women back in the house because it was a sign of male affluence and ability to earn money to have a kept wife. The norm has always been that women have always worked. They've had their babies in arms as they've done it. The problem is that our modern organisations have not adapted to modern ways of being flexible.
I did see both Mike and Lynn sort of disagreeing quite vehemently with your points there, especially when you mentioned what the Danish Prime Minister had said about British women wasting their education by choosing to stay at home.
This is all a narrative of if you like, of women wasting in education and so on. There was a YouGov poll for the Centre for Policy Studies back in 2009, which showed that 1% of mothers wanted to work full time. 1%. So it's not. This idea that it's a duty, it's onerous and it's boring and frustrating and so on to look after particularly young children. I think it's just not a narrative. It is a sort of. It is a largely, to my mind, a feminist narrative, and it's not one shared by the majority of women.
I don't think anybody said it's boring. I can't think of anything more fantastic to raise my children. It's been the work of my life that I will think is the most precious one, and I feel I've done, and other people have done, a pretty amazing job. So I think to go back to saying everybody wants to work 100% of the time, of course they don't. Most of my male clients don't want to work 100% of the time, and they want flexibility too. However, the people leading organisations often don't understand flexibility, flexing hours, different ways of working. Most people would like to, and if you go back and check with women, many of them will want to work, just often think it's impossible, and then once they're out of work, they lose confidence.
But there's another issue. We're talking about the choice, really, to work or to be a mother, and the constant battle that either the pressure from the media puts on women who choose to stay at home, or the pressure that the government puts on women to go back to work. But there's a self-pressure from a woman, and surely there's an economic pressure for want of a better life for your children by feeling that you can provide and finance it. And therefore there is the pressure and the commitment to work. So actually, women and families do need the support, which is where you see a lot of grandparents picking up children from the nursery or the school gates.
If I can say at this point, the grandparents have, this lady here spoke about in the past, women used to go out to the fields and mothers have always worked. Well, they might have always worked. They lived closer to they all lived much closer together in small units. Now people don't live so close to their families, to their grandparents, to their parents. And therefore, it's not as feasible for this to happen. I mean, social patterns have changed, but the needs of children have not. They have no choice over their birth. They will always crave and need the consistent love and attention of their mothers or a permanent substitute. The problem is that we're getting more and more young children going into these nurseries that are costing them an arm and a leg. At the end of the day, a lot of women find that it's costing their whole salary to get the children into childcare. And in these big nurseries, the children are not cared for like they would be if they were at home with one of their parents or possibly one of their grandparents. Grandparents can do a fabulous job.
But this is 2012, and some women have to work. Some women have gone and reached high levels within their degrees or masters and have commitments within their job that after they chose to have a baby, they then have to go back to work because they have to repay the money that they've been allocated for the maternity, and they don't have the grandparents around because society has changed.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I don't think that's ideal. I think we need to be much more creative in supporting mothers because we have a high incidence in depression in women, and we need to look at what that's about as well. So I'm all for the individual's right to choose, but also the opportunity that stops it being an either or. I work 100% of my time, I give my baby away. Most of us would have hated to do that. Admittedly, the burden is always put on the women, it would appear. The man contributed the sperm, but, he's got another role to play as well. And I think what we're finding, certainly in a lot of the senior women that I see, they feel that they are successfully combining both, and they're great role models to their children, and it's working for them. And it's not about materialism, it's about self-actualization.
But to combine both a career and motherhood, if there was a solution, we'd be bottling it and selling it to women who wanted both. Now, what is it? What's the key?
Well, I think, one, choose a good partner, and I think women are increasingly doing that. They're actually choosing people who are not necessarily the classic alpha male. They are working as a partnership where they're looking at the fact they both want children, they both want to do what they're really great at, the expert stuff that they've learned to do, they don't want to give it up, and they're taking turns, whether that's turns in the 1 week or turns every 5 years. They're developing something new, and I think the young modern people don't have this dichotomous thinking of either or. And the young men are much more attuned to the fact that they can be flexible too.
I think it's perfectly clear, though, that the majority of women don't want their partners to be equally involved in childcare. Mothers want to be the primary parent, and we can try and fight biology all we want, but it will out every time. And the lady was just talking about not choosing an alpha male. I think women forever, and certainly today, try and find the best partner they can, and there's just not enough damn alpha males around. So if they have to settle for a beta, or a gamma, or even a delta, they'll do it.
Well, it's very interesting to compare my senior clients, female, who, and I'm not saying, I mean, we've had a lot of assertions here, which are not all backed up with research. So I'm putting this clearly, it's a very small sample, I suppose, I'm looking at. And I'm very interested. The senior women all have very good, worked out, discussed relationships with their partners. They take turns, they do various things. What I find that many of the senior men in the city, say at the moment, are alone. They have created a contract with their partner that she will stay at home, he will go out, have a high-powered job. She won't see him, and there's a kind of contract slightly with the devil because he's going out to buy more things like private education or swimming pools or whatever it is. She doesn't see him. And those are the really troubled relationships I'm coming across because the men are getting in late, they're not talking, she's resentful. Now, it's a sweeping generalisation, but it's just, if we're being dichotomous, there are two extremes. What about a couple who right from the start look at what's the best way? Now, we're being very middle class and luxurious here because most families don't have that choice. They have to work to make a living wage. And that means that women's jobs, rather than fancy careers, are of critical importance in our economy. So we need to be looking at choosing the right partner, choosing the right business, the one that actually looks at fostering your talent and being flexible, even if that means letting you go for 5 years or letting you take a gap later. And we need to be getting the right kind of childcare that absolutely raises the best or gives children the best chance for their future, that isn't battery hens.
Yeah, I did actually mention earlier the point about the pressure from the economics of the home that women do have to work now in 2012. I think that's a very, very valid point.
Yeah,
not a choice.
If I can also say that part of our remit as Mothers at Home Matter is we are also campaigning very strongly for income splitting for couples with dependent children. So this would remove the current tax discrimination against the one-earner couple families by allowing them to access 2 personal tax allowances and therefore 2 basic rate tax bands, as dual earner families do. I mean, we have been fighting tooth and nail against the current policy on the child benefit, because how fair is that 2 people can bring in up to £49,000 each and still claim child benefit, when the one earner who earns £52,000 will find that their child benefit is being slashed, if not taken away altogether. That can't be right.
But that's still a very middle class issue.
Yes, it is very middle class, but the income splitting wouldn't be, because at the end of the day, if the man was out at work or the woman was out at work and one of the couple decided to stay at home, they would then get some of the tax benefit of. I mean, we used to have it many years ago, and this current government did say they were going to reinstate it. But I don't understand why Cameron hasn't done it. I think there's a lot of issues from the Lib Dems, who Nick Clegg is not one of our supporters, and I think that's where it's not come into play.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Juliet Spare. I'm joined in the studio with Lynn Burnham, Secretary of Mothers at Home Matter, Avril Lehman, who's on the telephone, and the leadership psychologist and founder of Whitewater Group, and Mike Buchanan, the Chief Executive of the Anti-Feminism League.
David Cameron has a long history of being very feminist friendly. Everything he does with relation to, with the family are the sorts of things that organisations like the Fawcett Society would very much approve of. He is not regarded by traditional conservative voters like myself as being a conservative.
What does Louise Mensch's resignation, giving up her job and citing the reason being to spend more time with her family, does this hinder or help the debate about what women should do? Well,
for a start, I mean, Louise Mensch was an A-lister. She was on an all-woman prospective parliamentary candidate shortlist. In fact, the legislation that allowed parties to do that was brought in by Harriet Harman in 2008, and in 2009 he introduced it for the Conservatives, and I resigned my membership that day. So here we have an example where, I really don't blame Louise Mensch at all. I think she's done absolutely the right thing, in her situation. But I think that the person who can take some criticism in this is David Cameron for basically going in for social engineering.
But wait a minute. How are you going to change something like Parliament, which is meant to represent its people, if constantly the constituencies fix it, just because they don't see it any other way, to have solidly male representation, because they don't actually think, because this is the one we see, this one thing we see is a kind of an unconscious bias. I don't believe that men are doing it deliberately. They just don't think of women. And I know Baroness Morris for the Tory party was very involved in beginning to change attitudes and make them look at even taking on women candidates. Oh my goodness, what century are we in?
Avril, it's been 33 years since we had our first female Prime Minister, and she was, by common consensus, the most impressive Prime Minister of the last century. It is really a bit sad, 33 years on, to be saying that women need, all women, shortlists. At the end of the day, the number of men who are interested in getting into politics, even today, vastly outnumbers the number of women, and that's why.
Often because of, and it's back to modern working hours, a modern system. Parliament was designed for men who went out and sat in their clubs all day, and they sat out all night, and the nanny put the children to bed. Well, we've not got a modern organisation that is particularly flexible.
Avril, I'm sorry, but Parliament
we need it changed.
Sorry, but the hours of Parliament have been changed years ago to suit women, and yet we're still having the same argument. I mean, why do organisations, whether it's Parliament or companies, always have to bend over backwards to give special treatment to women?
Wait a minute. Let's just think, what are the ratios of men? I think you've got it completely reversed. That they're not bending over backwards to help women. They're just challenging the quotas that are already in place, which are much more male-focused. I mean, I'm confused by your use of the word feminist, because it doesn't accord with any of the definitions I know, which is about kind of equality and fairness as human beings. I can't imagine anybody who wouldn't want that. But going back to Louise Mensch, I mean, I think we've got another different point there, rather than criticising her in her career. This decision, it's fascinating, because when somebody says, I want to spend more time with our family, it usually means that there's been some ghastly indiscretion, but that is not the case in this case. It's when men say it, it's always a bit suspect. But she has got a situation which is occurring much more often, which is the kind of global professions, where it means that I believe her partner is in New York. Now, I can imagine that being a very complex thing to manage. So, I mean, this is a very specific situation. I don't think it's necessarily indicative of anything other than the modern age we live in, where we are operating in a global stage.
But who becomes then the victim in all of this? If you say, Mike, the government's bending over backwards to help women, you say the government isn't helping women in any way by choosing to stay at home.
They're not.
The media and certain websites and forums can be vitriolic towards women who choose to stay at home. Mm. And you fight a good fight, Avril, for women having both. Mm-hmm. And this being a rather middle-class issue, and that there are the economic pressures of women having to work to help support their family and give their children a better life. So do children then become this victim? And what will they choose for their children?
Well, I think this is really a little insulting, because we're doing that again. I don't mean what you said, but to say, well, of course, children suffer. If you are, as a intensely engaged with doing the best for your children, you will do the best for your children, whether you're a stay-at-home, whether you're a mother who matters in the home, or you're a mother who also combines it with work. It will be the first thing on your thoughts. And I remember when my daughter Natasha was maybe 2, 3, and very variable, and I was leaving her with her carer, whom she still sees, and she said, "Oh, Mommy, why do you have to go to work?" Which is the thing that sticks a knife in every mother's heart. And I said, "Oh, sweetheart, I've got to go earn the money for da-da." And off I went. I came back in the evening. I said, "Natasha, I was wrong. That's not why I go to work. Of course you have to go to money, to get money for things. The reason I go to work is I love it. I love the work I do. And what I want for you in the future is to find the job that you're as passionate about." And she went, "Oh, right." And off she went. They've got the work ethic as well. They've got coping strategies. So why do we, the women who also have gone out to work, also have to justify? I think this is very clever, that women are constantly finding that their place is in the wrong. They're being blamed for whatever they do. We should be able to choose it either way. And the last person we should be attacking is another woman.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Juliet Spare, where we're talking about the decisions women have to make, whether to work or stay at home with their children. Joining me is Mike Buchanan, the Chief Executive of the Anti-Feminism League, Lynn Burnham, the Secretary of Mothers at Home Matter, and Avril Lehman is on the telephone, who's a leadership psychologist and founder of White Water Group.
I just want to say that the people here in the studio know that I'm sitting here with my Games Maker uniform on. I've been part of the London Olympics programme. I have been a driver and various other things. And I have been so fortunate to have that network of friends who have looked after my son whilst I've been doing this. But I have found that for the first time in 10 years since I had my son, that I've been doing this work for the Olympics, and I've been a driver, which has been quite a stressful job. And I could not have done this work had I had to think about what time does his club finish, what time have I got to be back to pick him up. I've known that he's been cared for by really good friends who he knows really well.
How do men go out to work on a daily basis? They've just delegated it all. Certainly as a woman who's worked throughout my children's life, and I crocheted together childcare so that I could have maximum time. I could do the walking the ducks, and feeding the ducks and walking to ballet. I could not have then focused as intensely on the people I work with if I weren't utterly confident in the choices I made about the people who would not just care for them in my absence, but add something different and special and give them that sense of being raised by aunties and the extended family that I have, but they're all over the world. Certainly as a psychologist, I would not have let anybody near my children that I didn't think would be psychologically enhancing. And I think women who go out to work where they can, and this is really indulgent, as I say, middle class, they work their butts off to get the right people helping and to build, as I say, this village that it does take to raise a child.
I'd just like to say, we have to ask, why is this a debate that rumbles on year after year, decade after decade? I mean, I'm 54 and it's been rumbling on for certainly all my adult life. And surely the reason that this subject gives women in particular so much angst is that women are doing more in the workplace when they would rather be at home with their children, and which is, to me, biological in origin. But if women prefer to be at work, and if more women found their work wonderful, as Avril does, then I guess there would be less of a problem.
But I still think we should mention that while there is that desire to work or have children, there is also the economic pressures that women are expected to go out to work.
I don't think there are the economic pressures, personally. No, I don't.
Why?
Lots of people do have issues and do need to bring in that second wage. There's no doubt about it. Unfortunately, that's the way society is today. But there are also ways in which you can cut back. We have one car in our family. We don't need two cars. We don't have expensive holidays. There are ways and means. If you truly believe that it's best for your family to be at home and support that growing up period.
I'd really like to thank my guests today for this lively discussion on whether women should work in the home or in the office or any job they choose. So thank you, Mike Buchanan, the Chief Executive of the Anti-Feminism League, Lynn Burnham, Secretary of Mothers at Home Matter, and Avril Lehman, who joined us on the telephone, the leadership psychologist and founder of White Water Group. You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Juliet Spare. The headlines are next.
Time. And only 14% of women, 1 in 7, was truly work-centred. Really was ambitious and work-focused in the way that men more typically are, and most childless women were focused in this group. So the women who are very, very work-focused are very untypical. I mean, the thing that we object to is women being shamed and vilified when they want to be stay-at-home mothers, for example. And some websites, I mean, Mumsnet comes to mind. I've read some things that have been said, have been written to stay-at-home mothers, and not necessarily mothers, but women who stay at home and are supported by a partner. And some of the rhetoric is vicious and cruel, quite frankly, and I think it's appalling.
Lynn Burnham, the Secretary of Mothers at Home Matter, you're agreeing with Mike there, nodding your head.
Mothers at Home Matter have been in existence for over 20 years. We were formerly known as Full-Time Mothers. But to get away from the issues of if you're not a full-time mother at home, are you not a good mother? We decided 18 months ago that we needed to change our names to Mothers at Home Matter. But we really do fight for the rights of children to have that bond with one of their parents. And in society throughout the ages, that person has been the mother. We're not against fathers being at home. Sometimes that is what is necessary in that particular family. Some fathers, their careers were never as important to them as the mothers were. But we strongly believe that at the end of the day, it's generally the mothers that provide that bond with the child. And the child needs that bond, especially in the early years.
How has your fight increased over the last few years then? Are you fighting harder to convince women to stay at home? What are your biggest battles?
Our biggest battles with government, with Parliament. That's where our battle lies. It's
For her family. With me in the studio today is Mike Buchanan, the Chief Executive of the Anti-Feminism League, Lynn Burnham, Secretary of Mothers at Home Matter, and taking part in the discussion on the telephone is Avril Lehman, a leadership psychologist and founder of Whitewater Group. Avril is married with 2 daughters and is writing a book on motherhood and coaching. What should a woman in 2012 put first? A career or her family? Mike Buchanan.
I think different women sort of have different inclinations here. I mean, there was some very interesting research published in 2000 by a lady called Dr. Catherine Hackim, who was then a senior research fellow at the London School of Economics. And her research indicated that about 17% of women were very much home-centred, very, very family-focused, children-focused. About 69% of women were what she called adaptive, so they would flex their working responsibilities and family responsibilities over.
Not with the mothers. Mothers in general would rather be at home in the first few years. Most mothers. I mean, there are women that can't wait to get back to work the minute that they've had a baby, and then that's fine. You know, we're not against women going back to work. It's about the choice, and I'm afraid in today's society there's very little choice. It's encouraged that every opportunity to get back to work. But it just doesn't work out that way. We saw from the riots last year just how, broken our society is at times. And we strongly believe that if children are to have the best chance in life, they need to bond with the mother. The mother needs to be able to have that time with their child in the early years. As time progresses, the children become more and more independent, and we're not against women working. We're not anti-feminism or anti-feminist, but we are there to support women because some people find it very hard.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. The Conservative Member of Parliament for the British Government, Louise Mensch, has recently announced she will stand down after 2 years in Parliament. In her resignation letter, Mrs Mensch thanked the Prime Minister David Cameron for his support, but said she'd been struggling for some time to find the best outcome for her family life and had decided, in order to keep the family together, to move to New York, where her husband lives. The 41-year-old thanked Mr Cameron for allowing her to work from her constituency on Thursdays and Fridays so she could spend more time with her children. But she added, unfortunately, it had not proved to be enough. She was sorry that despite her best efforts, she was unable to make the balancing act work.